Let's imagine just for a moment that what seemed impossible has happened. Canada became part of the United States, suddenly making the US the largest country on Earth, going from 3.8 to 7.6 million square miles, making it even larger than Russia. But the size is just the beginning. What changes would it actually make in the economy? We'll see 7 things that would be completely impacted. Starting with the map, going through the GDP, federal debt, all the way to the impact on workers, businesses, and the biggest problems that would show up. Starting with the impact on the map, because Canada is way too big, so each territory and province would likely become its own state. If that happened, it would increase the number of states from 50 to 63, adding 13 new stars to the US flag. So Alaska, which used to be the largest state, drops down 4 spots, becoming only the 4th largest, behind Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. Out of the 10 largest states, 7 are ex-Canadians. But when it comes to the list of the 10 largest cities, not much changes. Only Toronto and Montreal now make it into the top 10. But that's just the beginning. We will see what this country looks like in terms of GDP, jobs, taxes, and much more. So now it's a huge country. And now those new states have to use the US dollar, making the Canadian dollar begin to disappear, triggering a massive currency exchange throughout the world. The Canadian dollar is the 5th most used currency for reserves, so central banks around the world would begin to sell it off, causing its value to drop significantly. At the same time, the US dollar becomes even stronger. But before we see how this would impact the federal debt, the US is a superpower and businesses, let's go to the third impact, the GDP. The GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced in the country. And while the US in 2024 had a $29.1 trillion GDP, Canada's was $2.1 trillion. It's much less, but adding Canada to the US GDP, the US would see the biggest year-on-year growth since 1978 of over 7%. But when we talk about companies, the gap is even bigger. The largest Canadian company by market cap is the Royal Bank of Canada, $196 billion. But putting them on the list of the largest US companies, it would only rank 51st. That means no Canadian company would make it into the top 50 largest companies of this new country. But more discrepancies shows up in the list of the GDP per capita. From the states with the largest GDP per capita, the only addition to the top 10 ranking is the Northwest Territories, ranked 10th place with a per capita GDP of $90,000, followed by Nunavut in 12th place. But that's just because these territories are very rich in minerals, with a population of just 40,000, smaller than a city, so this inflates their figures. Now, if we compare other places, things look worse. On the ranking of the 63 states based on GDP per capita, British Columbia sits at 54th place, Ontario at 57th place, and Quebec 60th place. The new poorest state is no longer Mississippi, but Nova Scotia, with a per capita GDP of just 41,000. So the discrepancy between the South and the North in GDP per capita would be massive. But there's another thing that would affect everyone in this country, the federal debt. Because Canada also has its own federal debt at a much more controlled level, but still around $1.2 trillion. So the US would increase its already alarming public debt from 36.2 to 37.4 trillion. But this integration would also force the government to fund massive infrastructure projects, like highways, rail lines, more energy pipelines, etc., potentially increasing the debt even more. But perhaps that would be nothing compared to the massive economic return the US could see, because since they'd have a territory larger than Russia's, they could also explore what's in that territory. The US has a total oil reserve of 74 billion barrels. That's a lot, but Canada has 170 billion, making the US oil reserves increase by 129%. Sure, not every oil is the same, but that's just a small piece of the pie. Canada is abundant in metals like niobium, cobalt, graphite, and nickel, which are crucial for electric car batteries, wind turbines, smartphones, airplanes, and even missiles. On top of that, 20% of the world's fresh water, the 3rd largest forest cover in the world, etc. With that unification, the US becomes a natural resource superpower, with thousands of additional kilometers in arable land. In other words, it's now almost self-sufficient. And with global warming, thousands of new lands would become available in the future. But it's not just land. The US now has a giant access to the Arctic. With the ice melting, it opens up a massive new maritime route, making some sea routes way faster and a giant strategic advantage. But at the end of the day, what really matters is how a union of the two countries impacts the life of the ordinary people. And well, it could bring massive changes. For a Canadian to work in the US, they need a visa, but now that Canadians or American citizens, they'd have access to the entire US job market. Why is that a big change? Well, Canada's median income in 2021 was $50,000, while in the US it was $70,000. Several sectors with labor shortages like healthcare, construction, and technology could start to see more workers, but not everyone wins. At the same time, there could also be an influx of many less skilled workers, driving some wages down. When there are more people willing to do the same job, wages tend to fall. So while high-demand sectors would benefit, many Americans working in warehouses, retail, or construction might start feeling the pressure. But maybe that's not a big of a deal compared to the impact on businesses. In Canada, nearly 90% of private sector workers are employed by small and medium-sized enterprises. So with the removal of barriers, these companies would now face much more competition, forcing them to either adapt or shut down. But at the same time, all Canadian companies would now have access to the US consumer market, which is something unmatched. Also, the US companies would get direct access to the Canadian market, with 40 million new customers. But there's something else that would affect both businesses and regular people: the changing taxes. It would all depend on how the system is integrated. But if Canada simply adopts the US tax system 100%, sales tax would be the first big change. Just like in the US, each Canadian province charges a different sales tax, 7% in British Columbia and almost 10% in Quebec. But on top of that, there is also a 5% federal tax. So the total tax ranges from 5 to 15%. With Canada becoming part of the US, the federal tax disappears. But that's not all. There would also be big changes in income tax. For a Canadian who's now an American and has a low income, their income tax would fall from 15 to 10%. And for the middle class, taxes would also go down. And for an income of $100,000, the tax drops from 26 to 22%. But for higher incomes, above $250,000 per year, taxes would actually increase. That's because Canada's highest federal tax rate is 33%, while in the US it's 37%. But the biggest problem that perhaps all Canadians would face now is the most controversial of all: the public health care. In Canada, healthcare is universal and funded by taxes, but in the US, the system is mostly private, based on health insurance, meaning there is no guaranteed universal coverage. There are public programs like Medicare and Medicaid, but they only cover the elderly, low-income individuals, or people with disabilities. So Canadians would have a massive change in their healthcare system. But what do you think? Would you support a merger of the two countries? And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe so I can post more of these.